So welcome. Tonight, we are talking about how to get good grades in hard classes. And the purpose of this webinar is really to help you guys better understand from one angle what it means to take rigorous classes, why it's important in the college admission process, and then also from another angle to better understand how to set yourself up for success in those classes. So how to choose the right classes, how to make sure that once you're in those classes, you can do well in them and get good grades, because all of those things are going to become important factors in your college admission process, both in the US and in other countries as well, if any of you are looking to apply abroad in other places. So we're really excited to get started on this. I'm excited to pass it off to my two amazing colleagues. I have Angela Park Pennington and Gretchen Hoffman here. Gretchen is the academic director on our tutoring team. Angela is one of our college advisors, and they are going to talk you through all of those elements of how to choose your classes and why those classes are going to matter for your application. So I'm going to pass it along to them. And just so you all know, we do have a Q&A here in the webinar as well. So please use that. Ask questions throughout the presentation, and we will leave some time at the end to answer those questions if they don't already get answered during the course of the webinar. So take it away, Gretchen and Angela.
Thanks,
Hi.
Olivia.
Oh, yeah. I can go first, Gretchen.
Sure.
My name is Angela Park Pennington. Like Olivia said, I am a college advisor here at Logic Prep. So I'm working with students to prepare for college and build their college applications. I'm a former admissions officer from the University of Southern California, or USC, where I worked at the Marshall School of Business. And I've also evaluated applications for the UC, or the University of California system as well.
Awesome. And my name is Gretchen. I'm the academic director here at Logic Prep. So basically head of the all things tutoring related. So both for SAT and ACT prep, but also for academic support, which is maybe a little bit more relevant for this conversation. My alma mater is Princeton University. For some of you, if many of my students are here, you might know that I'm also in a part-time master's program at Oxford right now. So some of this studying and time management tips are very relevant to my current life as a student as well as a teacher. And I've been with Logic Prep since 2014, started as a part-time tutor and have been full-time here since 2016. So I'm very excited for today's conversation.
Yeah, I'm excited to share as well. We'll be covering a few topics. I'll share a little bit about what exactly is academic rigor and how it plays into the overall college application that you'll be building, before passing it off to Gretchen, who will give you lots of great tips and strategies as you are working through, your schoolwork now.
Excellent.
Great. So just to kind of set a foundation of understanding, in terms of academic rigor, a simple way to understand it is if you put yourself in the shoes of an admissions officer and you're evaluating applications, you might be seeing a lot of transcripts and from many different high schools and trying to equitably compare them. It probably wouldn't be very fair to look at a student who has straight A's in all very maybe standard courses versus a student who has straight A's in courses that have a lot of advanced levels or higher level coursework. So more difficult, more challenging courses. So admissions officers are tasked with the job of trying to to make a fair comparison of a student's academic performance and the standard to which they're holding themselves and pushing themselves while in high school, and how are they preparing themselves for college, which inevitably is going to be harder and more challenging than high school. So a few ways that you can demonstrate this is in the choices you make through your course selections. Depending on what's offered at your high school, maybe you're at a school that offers honors and AP courses, maybe you're at a school that offers the IB curriculum, or neither. Maybe your school is on a totally different, unique system. I know there are quite a few high schools out there that label the courses completely differently. Maybe they're called advanced classes or college prep classes, or maybe your school doesn't offer them in-house, but has an association with a local community college where you can do something called dual enrollment, and take classes externally from your high school. So there are lots of different types of opportunities. It's not one size fits all. And when you're making these choices, I think it's really important to kind of look at not just the courses that you'll be choosing for the upcoming year, but thinking big picture and thinking about the forthcoming years as well. And also really important to talk to your counselor when making these decisions. So the importance of academic rigor really comes into play in your college applications when admissions officers are trying to make an assessment and trying to understand what kind of student you are. Are you the type of student that likes to take maybe the easier road, or are you the kind of student that likes to really push yourself to your potential, challenge yourself to grow? You're really curious to learn and expand your knowledge, and maybe take a path that is going to potentially be a little bit more difficult, but provide you more opportunities to think more critically, to manage your time better, and to learn different topics that you might not have access to. It is, one of your transcript, and your academic performance becomes one of the most important factors on your college application. So most US colleges are employing what we call holistic admissions in their application review, which means that your academics, your transcript, your grades, that's not going to be the one and only thing that they look at. And certainly, I'm sure you've heard a lot about, extracurriculars and leadership and all of that, being important factors as well. But especially when it comes to highly selective institutions, they're really trying to make sure that they're admitting students who, are going to succeed on their campus. So they want to see a little peek, a little sneak preview of that by seeing your high school performance. And if you are taking the challenging courses and you're doing well in them, that's usually a pretty good sign that when you come to their college campus and are taking the much more rigorous college courses at their institution, that you would have a pretty good chance of doing well there too. So that does become one of the most important factors that they consider, in addition to extracurriculars and the character, who you are as a person and how you're able to demonstrate your passion for learning and your area of study and all those other wonderful things as well. But when it comes to academic rigor, I do think it's important for you to understand kind of why everybody's always saying it's important to get good grades versus just trying to just accept that and and chug through your days. So it does have a pretty important impact. So when it comes to rigor versus grades, a pretty common question that we get, and maybe a question that you've thought about a lot as well, is when you're making your course selections, should I take the standard level class, the on-level class, or regular, or should I take an honors, or they offer this in an AP level as well? What course should I choose? I'm not super confident that I'm going to get an A in the AP class. I know I'll get an A in the regular class. I'm not really sure. So you might be weighing a lot of these types of questions. The annoying answer to this question is that there's no real straightforward one answer. It honestly really depends. And it depends on a lot of things. It depends on your school, it depends on the teachers, it depends on the course, and it depends on your own personal situation as well. So when you're making your course selections, there are a few questions that I would encourage you to ask yourself. And the main kind of personal question that nobody can really answer for you or give you a ton of advice on is really the most important thing: balance. What else is on your plate? If you are juggling, maybe you're heavily involved in sports and it takes a lot of your time, and that's a really important commitment to you, for you. or maybe you're also planning on taking several other higher level courses. And maybe it's your first time, maybe you're now, going into your sophomore year or your junior year. It's really your first time ever taking an AP class. You're not really sure what to expect, and you're considering signing up for 3 or 4. Or maybe you have, a lot of different extracurriculars that you're planning on increasing your involvement in the following year, and you really want to do a good job because you're taking on some leadership positions. So you're going to be pulled in a few different directions. And you really want to be able to be at your best, perform at your best in kind of all those different, pots and balls that you're juggling. So I would, one way to try to help yourself make that decision is to speak with your teachers. Maybe it's your current teacher in that subject. Maybe so. For example, let's use math. You're thinking about choosing a Calc AP class. You're thinking, should I do AB? Should I do BC? If those are options at your school, or should I, take the honors option? Perhaps you could talk to your current math teacher now and ask for their recommendation. You might also want to talk to the teachers who are teaching those AP courses and ask about the expectations. You can also talk to former students who have taken that class recently or they're in it now, and talk to them about, what does the homework look like? How many quizzes and tests are we talking here? I'm thinking about taking, these 3 AP classes that you're currently in now. How is it juggling all of those together? So, definitely do your research and try to, figure out what is the actual time commitment, what are the expectations going to be, very practically speaking. I wrote context of your school environment here. This could be a good thing to discuss, helpful to discuss with your counselor. So when your application is being considered by admissions officers, they're not necessarily just looking at your application by itself. They will consider your application compared to the rest of the applications that they're also receiving from your same high school. So again, an effort for, trying to be fair. So talk to your counselor about, what are some colleges that you're planning to apply to? What are some, in the past or even currently now, what are some baseline kind of expectations that, I should have for myself in terms of what I'm taking on, so that you want to, especially if you're attending kind of a larger high school where it's not as easy to just know from your peers or your classmates what everybody else is taking. And you want to have a good idea of where do I stand, in comparison to the rest of my class or in comparison to students in the past. So that's a good question to talk about with your counselor. And then also alignment with your intended field of study. Sorry, Gretchen, for some
Sorry.
reason, I'm going upwards instead of downwards. Alignment with your intended field of study. Many of you may not know what your intended field of study is yet, and that's totally fine. If you do know, then that should be a helpful factor for you. If you know that, okay, economics, for example, is a major that I'm potentially considering applying to for college, then and your school happens to offer econ classes, especially at the higher level, then definitely take those. Not only is it aligned with your intended major, but it'll be good preparation for you to have a baseline understanding, to have a really, at least understand the foundational concepts before you, go on to college and begin to study it more rigorously. If you know what your intended field of study is, but your school doesn't offer any courses or electives or anything like that that are related to that subject, there are other ways about that. Like I mentioned community college earlier for my US students here. Perhaps you can find a course outside of your high school that will allow you to explore this subject. And that's great. Colleges love to see that too, because it shows that you're not limiting yourself with the opportunities that are easily available to you, but you're now, you're going outside to see, I'm so curious about this. I'm thirsty for knowledge. Where can I get it? And you're seeking it out. That's definitely something that colleges love to see. Okay. The value of planning ahead. This is, I think, really important for some of our younger students who are in maybe your freshman or sophomore year right now, and you're thinking about, you're in a position where you're able to think about the big picture. And the reason for that is because for some high schools, there may be prerequisites. There may be some classes that you're required to take in order to be eligible or to qualify to take a higher level course. And you'll be able to know this by looking at, sometimes it's on your school website, or, there's generally like a course packet. Maybe it's a PDF that your school sends out. And you'll be able to see, what subjects or what courses are coming up ahead, and what are the requirements to be able to take those classes. So I wrote here, sometimes it can be helpful to work backwards. Because as a freshman, maybe you are a rising freshman now, you probably don't have that much flexibility in choosing your courses. Generally for a freshman, it's pretty fixed. You might be able to choose an elective course here and there, but you don't have a ton of flexibility in actually, personalizing or making personal choices in your coursework. But what you can do at this point is start thinking about your end goal. By the time I'm in my senior year, I want to be able to take these AP classes or these honors classes. I know that I'm interested. I know that I'm a science guy. I really like my science courses. My school offers, AP physics. What do I need in order to be able to take AP physics later on? So those are, ways that you can plan ahead. Maybe take a moment, sit down with either your school counselor, if you're a logic prep student, then, with your college advisor here, to start planning out, all 4 years, what you hope to take each year. Obviously, some of that can change from year to year, but just kind of having a vision can be really helpful. And it can also motivate you if you know that one of the prerequisites is you must get an A or a B in this class in order to be able to take this next level. And then electives and outside coursework. I kind of mentioned this in the previous slide, but those are opportunities to not just show the colleges that you're applying to that you're interested in a particular subject, but again, it's really helpful for yourself to be able to explore this area even more. And yeah, to also understand, how can I be successful in college later on, is I need to build some of these really core skills as a high schooler. And Gretchen's going to talk more about those skills, tangible skills, in a bit, but also those foundational courses can give you a really strong baseline knowledge. And I think, students oftentimes can change their major in college. So you don't necessarily have to feel like you are married to your decision that you made in, 10th grade. But generally, I do find that some students, there's maybe like a common denominator. Maybe you are generally a STEM person, so you really like, taking classes in the sciences. Maybe it's the pure sciences, maybe it's the applied sciences, or maybe you're somebody who knows that you really want to study business, and your school doesn't offer many business courses. But when students are applying to business majors, you can kind of look ahead at what courses are in the curriculum for that major, and that will give you a good understanding of, oh, okay, if I want to be successful in this major, and this major requires a lot of, maybe math classes, or this major requires a lot of writing classes, then it's probably a good sign that those are skills that you want to build up and during high school. I will use business as an example in case there are a lot of students interested in business here today. But definitely one thing that admissions officers really keep an eye out for our business applicants is your performance in your math classes. So really try to push yourself, to challenge yourself to take the highest level courses available when it comes to math at your high school. And it is really important to perform well in those courses as well. So yeah, so I'll pass it on to Gretchen to talk a little bit about how to perform well in those courses.
Thanks so much, Angela. No, that was great. And just to piggyback off of something that you were saying about maybe changing your major at some point, I think you don't really necessarily know what studying business is going to look like until you're in some of these more advanced courses or until you're in college, whether it's business or biology. I studied biology and I had a lot of people that were in courses with me that thought they wanted to do biology or pre-med and then switched out after the first year. And I think if you take some of these more advanced courses in high school, if you have the opportunity to do so, you kind of learn a little bit more about yourself in that process, which is helpful to know earlier rather than later.
Definitely, definitely.
All right. So yeah. So you've talked to your college advisor, either at Logic Prep or your college counselor, your, guidance counselor at school. You've decided what your hard classes are going to be next year, or maybe even you did this last year in preparation for this year. Now you're in those hard classes. So what do you do to make sure that you can do as well as you can? So when you're thinking ahead and trying to set yourself up for success, I encourage you to think about a couple of different perspectives. And then the first one is to just know what works for you. So not all students are created equal. What works for me as I'm studying does not necessarily work for the person next to me as they're studying, or even as we're taking notes. So do a little bit of self-reflection to understand what kind of learner are you? Are you a visual learner? Are you an auditory learner? When you study, does it generally help you to draw things out? Does it help you to rewrite them a million times? Does it help you to repeat them or to listen to them a million times? Maybe not a million, but what mode is most helpful for you as you're learning? And it might depend on the class. You might have, most of us are not a single learning style. We have kind of a mix, but sort of a preferred way of learning. So think about what actually works for you and kind of reflect about what's worked for you in the past. This is really tapping into this thing called metacognition, which is learning about how you learn. And the more that you can be an aware learner about what's working for you, what's not working for you, both in the past, but then also as you enter these hard classes, what's working and not working so you can make adjustments, the better you'll be able to make those adjustments and prepare yourself for the ultimate success at the end of the course. The other piece I want you to consider is to know who your teacher is. So, and how they teach and how they administer assignments and how they administer the information, like the notes before and after the class. Because your preferred note-taking style might work really well for one teacher's teaching method, but it might not work super well for another one. So you're going to kind of have to play around and match what works for you with what works for that teacher. And maybe you have a couple of different approaches in a couple of different of these more challenging classes. So just as an example, a lot of teachers in these more advanced classes and in college will teach based on a slideshow presentation. It's really common to do that, really common for them to either post the slides beforehand, and then you can print them out and annotate them as you're going along through the class, or maybe they only post the slides afterwards because they don't want you to kind of read ahead and they want you to actually pay attention in the class. Knowing that and whether you're going to be able to review the information before or print it out or be able to annotate the slides as you go, or whether you're going to have to take notes and then kind of assimilate them with the slides that the teacher is going to be posting later. That makes a really big difference in terms of the way that you're going to be taking your notes and also the way that you're going to be studying. So know how your teacher is going to be presenting the material. You'll find that out as it goes along. You're obviously not going to know that in advance. And also what resources and support they will, I'm kind of skipping around here, what resources and support they will or won't offer. So like I said, are they going to be posting all of these slides on the on Blackboard or some sort of website afterwards? Are the slides going to be annotated that they post? Are they just going to be the bare bones slides? Are they going to put you'll learn this as you start to actually take the class, but adjusting what your habits are to what you're getting from your teacher is going to be really important. And then finally, just in terms of success in the course itself, not necessarily so much for the end of year exam, but what are your teachers' expectations? They're generally going to be higher for these more challenging classes. And the more that you can get feedback early on to know, okay, this is what my teacher expects from an assignment, and this is how I can do well in this class, the more information of that you can gather and feedback from your teacher that you can gather early on, the better you'll be positioning yourself to be able to ultimately succeed in that class. And so that might look like finishing your assignment a little bit earlier than the deadline so that you can get your teacher to look it over and maybe give you, some pointers or make some suggestions if that's something that they're open to doing. But all of those things are good things to prioritize learning about the teacher as you begin the course. And then accordingly, depending on who you are, what kind of learner you are, depending on who your teacher is and what kind of teacher they are, you're going to want to develop the appropriate strategies for time management, for note-taking, for studying. And like I said, this is not a one-size-fits-all scenario. What works for you is not necessarily going to work for someone else. And what works for you is not necessarily going to work in all classes that you take. So you might have to make some adjustments depending on what is the content that's being covered and also who the teacher is and how they're teaching it. So with that in mind, as we kind of go a little bit further into the presentation, and I'm throwing out some techniques and some tips for note-taking and studying and such, think of them as a toolbox. None of these are the right way to study. They are different things you could try on. And just like in a toolbox, you're not going to use a hammer for every single tool or every single job that you have around the house. Some jobs are going to require a screwdriver. So within this toolbox, some of these techniques are going to be more appropriate in certain situations, and some of these techniques are going to be more appropriate in others. Oops, I went the wrong way. Okay, so before we get into those actual techniques, I want to talk a little bit about what learning is essentially, or some different ways we can think about what learning is. And essentially, when you're learning, you're building memories, right? And so one of the things that is really important for building memories, I think the two things that I'm going to keep coming back to a lot in this presentation are repetition, and also how meaningful that memory was when you first had it. So if you think about remembering something from your childhood or from a million years ago, you probably don't remember something that's really mundane. But if you remember something from a number of years ago, it's probably because it made a really big impact on you or because you were really active in that experience. And so when you're trying to learn something and you're trying to commit it to memory, that's what we want to accomplish. We want to have it be a really active experience. We want to have it be like a memorable experience so that you can then go back and recall it later. And so I'll be talking a lot about, as you're studying, trying to make it as active as possible. When you're taking notes, trying to make it as active as possible so that you're really engaged in that moment. And therefore that memory is a little bit stronger and less work for you have to dig up when you need to recall on it for some assessment. So what we're looking at here is there's this guy named Ebbinghaus. You can look up a little bit more. I'm not going to go into fully what his background is, but basically he came up with this sort of schema to think about how over time, this is kind of obvious, the information that you retain is going to decrease. So you're going to remember basically everything you just learned if you leave the class and you were to repeat it all to somebody, is at least if you understood it all. But then, a little bit after the class is over, end of the day, you're probably not going to remember all those details. Next day, definitely not going to remember all those details. And if you don't revisit it, then 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, 2 months from now, that percent of information retained is going to be pretty low. And so the way that we want to combat this is by what they call space review or spaced learning. And so that just basically means kind of repetition and kind of spacing the repetition out. So you have your original learning, which is you're sitting in the class, you're learning all this material for the first time, you start forgetting or losing that information, and then you are going to need to review it. And that kind of brings you back up to 100%. And so every time you do that, it brings you up to 100%. But another couple of things I want you to notice about this graph for the spaced review that's on the right-hand side is that after every review, let's say like if you were to look at the original learning curve and the dotted line that continues down, it gets pretty close to zero. Like you're going to not retain most unless it's a really engaging class or really something you're really interested in. you're probably not going to retain most of that information. If you review it, you'll still lose it over time, but the like where it plateaus, that dotted line is going to be higher. So you'll still retain more of it than you did if you had never reviewed it. And that kind of happens sequentially more and more. The more times you review, the more you're going to retain ultimately long term. You're still going to end up forgetting some stuff, but the where it plateaus is going to be a little bit higher, which is ultimately kind of what you want. What's not really shown here also, and what's important to think about is kind of when these reviews are going to happen. And there's no real one right answer, but I would encourage you, you do lose a lot of information even after 24 hours, even after 2 days. And so if you can make the first review of your material, especially if you're in a really challenging course, within 48 hours of when you first learn it, and that review can be something like, maybe your teacher doesn't print out or doesn't give you the notes in advance. They give you the slideshow afterwards. So you take your messy notes and then you want to like kind of copy them over in a nicer way onto the slideshow presentation after they actually send it to you. That would be a good example of what a first review would look like. It's like, okay, let me kind of organize the notes that I just took, that I just tried to absorb. I'll often encourage my ACT and SAT students to do this, even if you've had meetings with me and you've had trouble with retention. Do it after your lesson is over. So like 15 minutes after your lesson is over, like before you get up off your table, this doesn't count as your first review. Just sort of like consolidate what it was that you just learned. What were your takeaways from that lesson? Then get up, whatever, next day, review what those takeaways were, so that by the time you get to your practice test on Saturday, it's not all gone into the ether. So more frequent review, the better. The more often the review, the better in terms of how much you're going to be able to retain. Obviously, we don't have more than 24 hours in the day, and you're going to be taking more than one of these more difficult courses, most likely, and you have other extracurriculars to balance. So it's not going to be perfect, but the more you can try to re-engage with the material on a repeated basis, the easier it's going to be for you ultimately to regather that information at the end of the year when you take the final AP exam, IB exam, whatever it is. So some tips for time management. Again, this is a sampling. This is not comprehensive, and what works for one person may not always work for someone else. But with all those caveats in mind, first piece of advice is exactly what we were just talking about. Study as you go. Don't wait for the end of the year exam. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is that if you wait until, months and months later, the amount of information that you've forgotten that you then have to reteach yourself is going to be a lot more than if you are engaging with it on a frequent basis. The second reason is that in these more difficult courses, and I can speak from my personal experience with chemistry and biology, which I tutor both, this information really builds on itself. So if you're in chemistry and you're having trouble with the stoichiometry unit and you're like, I'm just gonna whatever, this unit was bad, let me just move on to the next one and I'll deal with that later. It's not really going to work for you very well, because that stoichiometry is going to come back again and again and again and again. Same thing with naming chemical compounds or whatever it is. So that's just one example, and I'm sure it's not restricted to biology and chemistry that happens. So if you have a bad test, don't just say, I'm just going to forget about that and wait until the end of the year to kind of address it. Address it as soon as you can, because the content's going to build on itself. And the earlier you can fill in those gaps, the more the information that you're going to receive afterwards is going to make sense. And then, so that's advice for throughout the year. But let's suppose maybe you're in an AP or an IB class and you have an exam coming up in May right now. So if you're in that position right now, you're not super late. We still have a little bit of time. Make sure, hopefully you've been studying a little bit, but what you want to do is to make a plan. What's nice about these more challenging courses that are standardized, such as the AP and the IB curriculum, is that they're posted online. So you can find a course outline. If you look at the IB website or the AP website, you can find all the learning objectives posted if your teacher hasn't already shared them with you. And then you can just sort of treat it as a study guide and say, yep, I understand that. Yep, I understand that. Yep, I understand that. And, move through them that way. If you're a little bit behind on your AP or IB studying right now and you're sitting down to do that and you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, focus on the things that represent the biggest percentage of the test. So if 50%, that's crazy, but if 30% of the test is on one kind of basic concept and the rest of them are all like 10 or 15%. Make sure you really understand that 30% topic. So that would be a good place to start your studying, as well as anywhere that you really felt like that was a hard unit for you or that you didn't fully grasp. So map out a plan. If you're a little bit rushed on your plan, prioritize. And then if you're a procrastinator, which I can relate to, there are some tools you can use. These are just a couple of them. Accountability buddies are huge. So if you can have someone that you're studying with, someone in your class that like you'll have fun studying with them, but also you'll get some stuff done. If you set up a review session and you say, okay, I'm going to review unit 1. Can we talk about unit 1 together on Monday? Okay, we're going to review unit 2. We'll talk about unit 2 together on Tuesday, or whatever your spacing is. Having that sort of deadline where you're accountable to another person can be really helpful, especially if you're not able to do that just for your own kind of internal deadlines that you set for yourself. And then a technique that I have used throughout my life and still do is that if you are really having trouble getting started because you feel kind of anxious or because you just don't want to do it, or you don't want to think about it, just set a timer, set it for 20 minutes, say I can do anything for 20 minutes and just do it. And then most likely you'll probably continue beyond those 20 minutes, but just set a timer for a time period that doesn't feel unreasonable. Just get started. Once you get started, it's going to be easier. This is advice I need to tell myself every single day. So, good to practice. All right. I'm going to go through these next couple of slides a little bit quickly, but essentially I polled our tutors for some tips and techniques that they like to use, both when they're in teaching, but also when they're in the classroom. We've got number of our tutors are also doing graduate programs such as masters or MBAs, or we've got a current tutor who is starting medical school right now. So all of them have some really good advice from actually being in your shoes as the learner. Themes that are going to come up here are being active, as I've mentioned before. So as you're taking notes, it's best in terms of a learning experience if you can think of yourself not just being a scribe that's documenting everything that's being said. These days we've got technology that can do that. Like that's not really the main point of your taking notes, most likely. I'll give you a caveat in a second. But what's best for you to do if you like really want to be engaging with material and learning it is to be kind of have a little bit of a preview before you go into the class. So if you know we're going to be talking about unit 2 tomorrow, I know unit 2 is acids and bases. I'm throwing out random names here, but maybe you watch a couple of YouTube videos about acids and bases before you go. You don't have to get into the weeds and get into the details, but if you just kind of understand sort of an outline of what it is that you're going to be talking about, then when you go into the class and you start getting inundated with all those details, you'll have sort of a mental framework to be able to slot them into and to be able to understand the material. So if possible, and I know, these years that you're taking all these advanced classes like sophomore, junior, senior year are all crazy, but if possible, if you can preview the material a little bit before the class, whether it's with a textbook or a YouTube video or whatever it may be, that's going to be really helpful and a really good technique to use in college too. Once you get to those challenging classes. Then when you're actually in the class, again, this depends on what your teacher's giving you. If your teacher's going to be posting all of the slides and all of their annotations of the slides online after the class is over, you don't need to write down everything that they're saying. You're going to have that information. And some teachers, especially at the college level with permission, will even allow you to do like a voice recording so that you can be a little bit less kind of fixated on capturing every word because it's on the recording. And what that'll allow you to do is to actually listen and engage more actively because you're not worried about just writing everything down. You're thinking about what the teacher is actually saying. So that would just be some advice that I would give you to try to like reconceptualize the way that you're taking notes. If you're going to be able to have access to all of the information later, which in these technological ages, you most likely will in some way, shape, or form, think about yourself more as an active participant in the class rather than as a passive scribe of writing everything down. Couple of pieces of advice about using technology to your advantage, but I think you guys can all figure that out. So this is one note-taking of many that are out there in the world. And like I said, there's no one best way to take notes, but this is one that our tutor, Ashutosh, who's actually the one that finishes MBA and is now going into med school, has talked to me a lot about, and it's really interesting. I definitely did not take notes this way when I was in college or in high school. But essentially it's called the QEC method, which stands for question, evidence, conclusion. And basically the idea is you're trying to build, critically engage with the material as you're learning it, and you're sort of trying to build a framework of what's being thrown at you rather than just writing everything down sort of willy-nilly. And the way that this technique kind of wants you to organize the information is, what are the main learning questions? Like, what are the things that they could ask me on a test? What are the things that we're trying to accomplish in this unit? And then beneath those questions, you're going to write down pieces of evidence to address that question. At the very end, you can write your conclusion to the question. So actually, Ashu, when he was talking to me about this technique for studying and how he's used this in grad school, is that he only does the questions during the class. So he'll kind of sit back, he'll listen to the class, he'll write down the questions as the class goes on. And then his sort of first review that he does is to then, after the class is over, see if he can answer those questions, see if he can fill in the evidence without going back to the lecture slides or the lecture video, to see how much he was able to retain. And then at the very end, you can write your conclusion to the question. So he kind of focuses a little bit more on the Q and the E, but that's a really interesting way to focus on it, is mostly in the lecture, just think about writing down, what are the critical questions? What are the things I'm supposed to be knowing about this unit that I'm being taught? And then afterwards, you can kind of fill in the gaps. Or during the lesson, you can fill in the gaps, whatever works best for you. So just as an example, so that you have something to visualize, silly example, but that to how this might work. We might be having a lecture about dogs and cats and the different types of pets and things like that, and what are the pros and cons. And so the question that I might be talking to you about, all the things that make dogs loyal. And so that overarching question that organizes that information is, are dogs loyal? And then again, you can either write the evidence during the lesson, or you can use that as your first review afterwards, as Ashu does. Kind of try to think of all the things that makes dogs loyal. And then all of these questions that you've written down, these are your study guide questions. So when you go and study for the exam, you cover up the evidence. Those are the questions. Those are the things you want to be quizzing yourself on. And then, peel off your sticky note or take away your hand, see if you were able to identify all the pieces of evidence that were mentioned in the lecture. Okay, I made way too many slides, but basically when you're studying, main themes are remove distractions and make it active. So do not disturb is your friend. We live in a technological age with so many notifications and distractions. So put your phone on do not disturb, put your laptop on do not disturb, highly recommend it. There are some apps out there that will also prevent you from, like, even if your phone's on do not disturb, if you try to pick it up and go into Instagram or TikTok, it'll block you from doing that, or you can ask it to block you from doing that. So take advantage of those. There's a couple here. I haven't used either one of them, but the internet says they're good. So try them out. As far as music goes, this can be a little bit controversial between teenagers and parents. I don't think that there's a one right answer for using music or not using music when you're studying, but be mindful about it. Go back to that metacognition idea. Be really honest with yourself. Am I really able to focus right now? Or is it just more fun for me to have the music in the background? For me personally, when I'm working on something, it's really good to have music that does not have lyrics in the background. If I'm reading something, I can't have music. And I've just learned about that about myself over time. So just be aware. Noise canceling headphones, however, are great, whether you're listening to music with them or not. Highly recommend, or as you're studying. I will leave, I think, with this last slide that is, or maybe two last slides before we go to the Q&A. This is a technique for studying called the Feynman technique. And basically, essentially what it is teaching someone else what you've learned, or writing about something as if you're going to teach it to someone else what you've learned. And this is one of the best ways to identify what you know and what you don't know. If you try to explain it to someone and you're like, I don't really understand the connection between what I was about to say and what I'm going to say next, that's a gap that you have that you need to fill. So go back to your notes, figure out what that gap is, learn that, kind of put that into your explanation. And so whether you do this writing it out, if you're more of a person that learns well by writing, or whether you do this talking out to someone who will listen to you, or whether you do this in a study group, this is a really good way to test what you know and fill in the gaps of what you don't know. We'll share these slides afterwards, but here are some online resources that you can use when you're studying. YouTube is really great for a lot of things. This Crash Course in Organic Chemistry tutor YouTube channels are excellent in terms of previewing material and reviewing it. I will say for ChatGPT and any math solvers that you use, do it with caution. These things hallucinate. They don't always do things correctly. And the way I would recommend you use these if you're studying is if you have a question. If you're like, I don't understand what this paper is, or what this topic is saying in my textbook, you can type in a ChatGPT, explain this topic to me as if I was a 5th grader. Explain this topic to me as if I was a 6th grader, 7th grader, 8th grader, kind of move the way up. Again, use it with caution. Don't use it to produce anything that you're going to be turning in, but it can be a useful tool for actually studying. And then finally, get support. I would say don't underestimate the power. Oh, I meant to write here. Don't underestimate the power of a study group. Talking to your peers, explaining things, getting their questions, and trying to formulate a response to it is all really helpful. Form relationships with your teachers. Go to extra help with them if they offer it. This will also be really good for teacher recommendation letters that you'll ultimately ask. And then if you need extra help, tutoring is always a really good resource. And so I'll put this slide up. Again, we'll send this out later to everybody. But we've got a lot of tutors that can help you in kind of almost everything that you're studying, except for some of the foreign languages. Whew. Okay, sorry guys, I over-prepared a little bit, but here we go. Wanted to leave a little bit of time for Q&A. So if you guys put anything that you've got into the Q&A, including any favorite resources you have for studying, we will share those with everybody afterwards. All right.
Gretchen, those were some really great tips that I wish I had when I was a student too. Really helpful.
Thank you. Thank you. It looks like a couple of these questions are more geared for you, Angela.
So I'll read the first one out loud.
Mm-hmm.
If anybody is searching for where you can input the questions, there's a Q&A button you should be able to see there. So the first question is, how important is the bilingual diploma? Will it give me an advantage, or does it not matter as much? Because I'm considering taking Portuguese B as my second language for a higher grade, instead of Portuguese A, which will give me the bilingual diploma, but might be harder to get a higher grade. Okay, so I will preface this by saying I am definitely more experienced with working with our US students who are in the AP curriculum, but I have worked with several students in the IB curriculum as well. So having said that, this seems like a situation where it would definitely be good to maybe check in with your counselor to see, what are the rest of your peers kind of doing. If it's a situation where it's, maybe it's not as significant of a decision as it might feel to you. If there are a pretty, either even split or a good number of other students who are not going that route. Or if it's a situation where pretty much everybody in your school is going this route and you would be kind of a lone application without this bilingual diploma. And when colleges are reviewing your application and seeing that difference, it might stand out. I would also consider what is your intended field of study? Is language going to be a big part of that, or is it kind of unrelated? That is certainly something, a factor that college admissions offices are going to think about. Oh, it went away. When reviewing your application. In general, so if kind of you do your research, you're talking to your counselor and you've got your answers, and it kind of still comes down to, should I do one or the other? I might recommend going the path that will allow you to get the higher grade, but again, that would really just be kind of I would say you would probably need to get some of those more personal situation type questions answered first. And then
I can take the most recent one that just came in, just to kind of bounce back and forth a little bit. So we have a question about, what about knowing the balance between asking your teacher for help or then asking your teacher for too much help, but maybe becoming an annoyance. And I would say that probably, this really depends on the student. So I think you probably have a good sense of like where that boundary line is. And I think you can also ask your teacher if it's too much. But what I would say is that the more you can come into your teacher with extra help with prepared questions. So like if you can demonstrate that you have already done some studying on your own, you've already watched a couple of YouTube videos, you've already kind of done the practice material and tried to figure out why the right answer was the right answer. And then you're going into extra help with some organized sort of themes of what you're asking for the extra help with. I find it very hard to imagine any teacher that would be kind of annoyed by that. I can imagine a teacher perhaps being annoyed if you come to them with like every little question that you have without doing a whole lot of like work on your own to try to answer it first. What I will say though is don't take this advice that I'm giving you to the extreme. So I think when I was in college, for example, I had this mentality that I had to exhaust all of my resources available to me before I went in for extra help. And I really regret that I didn't go in for extra help more and establish relationships with my professors and my TAs, because they weren't expecting me to do all of that. So I would say if you are concerned that you are maybe annoying your teacher, then make sure you're doing the legwork on your own. If your teacher is someone who says, I have open office hours, come to my office hours, and they are really encouraging you to do so, then I think you can lower that bar a little bit for yourself and just come in with the random questions that you have.
Yeah, definitely. As an advisor now, and having taught in the past, and Gretchen, I'm sure you can agree with this too, is always loved when students came with good questions, and it shows that you're interested and you care and you want to learn, and you also value your teacher's input. So always nice.
Yeah, I think the bar for becoming an annoyance is probably pretty high for for most teachers, unless perhaps you're like dominating their time and they're not able to get to other students that also have questions during that extra help session.
All right, so the next question says, would it be better for IB students to have 7s and HLs and 6s and SLs, or 7s and SLs and 6s and HLs? Okay, I think maybe the first part might have been 6s and HLs and 7s and SLs. I don't blame you. Those are a lot of numbers and letters to write. So this could be a situation where the difference between the 7 and the 6 might not make as big of a difference, may not be as meaningful in the grand, kind of scheme of things. However, kind of where it might come into more play is, again, alignment to your major. So what is the subject that you're thinking about? And then if you're in the planning stage now of course selection, versus I'm in this situation now, and I'm wondering kind of retrospectively or retroactively. So if you're in the planning stage, when you're thinking about rigor, one other I mentioned this earlier when going over this in my slides, but I don't think I defined it as clearly. Is not just thinking about how the coursework you select presents itself on your transcript, but you also have to think a little bit about, again, this kind of ties back into the whole balance, context, which is that your rigorous classes are going to be asking a lot from you. Your HL classes are going to be asking a lot more from you. They're going to be demanding more from you from your SL courses. So when selecting your courses, you want to think about, again, the different areas that you're going to be pulled in. So when, again, kind of to summarize, pick the courses where you are going to be pushed. You're confident that you will do well, especially if it's a course that aligns with your major. And get the support that you need, utilize all of the resources that are available to you. And then maybe don't sweat the 6 versus the 7 too much at the end of the day. I think, you're going to get a lot of kind of different answers from depending on who you speak with, even from different admissions officers. It can become a little bit subjective when some admissions officers are looking at maybe the total kind of predicted score first before maybe kind of digging into the nitty-gritty of what composes that score. or, some admissions officers prefer to read, versus looking at the predicted score first, kind of the breakdown of the actual courses and the breakdown of the HLs versus the SLs. So it does become quite subjective, but at the end of the day, I don't think there are too many admissions officers out there or situations in the admissions committee room where a 6 versus a 7 is going to make a huge difference in terms of, being the deal breaker or maker. Usually it's going to be a lot of other factors in that decision. So don't stress too much, but do try to, educate, inform yourself as much as possible to set yourself up for success.
Seems like a lot of these situations are just so personal that you really, like you said, Angela, you want to think about the context. And so if you have a guidance counselor at school that you can talk through the bigger picture with, or a college advisor at Logic Prep that you can talk through the bigger picture with, I think that's always a really helpful thing, because it's not, that's not an answer you can answer. Is it better a 6 in an HL or a 7 in an SL? Without the context, it's an impossible question to answer.
Yeah.
All right. Do we have any other questions from the group? Angela, I had one question for you that occurred to me when you were presenting.
Yeah, great.
Does the school's policy about having like an add drop period of maybe like starting out in a, like if you're on the fence about doing BC Calc versus AB Calc, for example, and you know that your school will not allow you to go from AB to BC after a month if you decide that you're not being challenged enough, but it will let you drop down after a month if you're being too challenged. Does that come into play in these decisions or the conversations that you are having with your students?
Oh, that is such a great question. I'm so glad you brought that up. Yeah, that is definitely one route that I recommend to students if they're really kind of on the fence. They're feeling, like, oh, I'm a pretty mathy person. I just don't know if I'm a Calc BC person, because I've heard from other students that this teacher is really, really hard, or, and the AB teacher is like really nice, and they're trying to make this decision based off of those kind of subjective factors. Um, and that's definitely one piece of advice I do give my students is, hey, you have a little bit of a grace period there. Maybe if it is something where it's coming down to the teaching style and, the classroom dynamics, or, the cadence of the assignments, then maybe just give yourself that chance, that 1 month chance, or maybe at some schools it's less than that or a little more than that. But either way, I think even 2 weeks sometimes is a good enough amount of time for you to kind of get to know, this is something I can manage, I can take this on, versus it's day 2 and I feel lost and I feel a little bit nervous to even ask questions because everybody else seems to know what's going on. The teacher doesn't really seem to, even allow enough time for questions in the class. So yeah, I do think that taking advantage of that window of opportunity is a great thing to do.
Olivia, should I squeeze out one more answer before we finish?
Yeah, let's just answer this one question that just came in and then we'll wrap up.
Excellent. All right. So the question was, what resources are available to practice for IB test papers? And this is a really good question. In the slides, and I will maybe put it in the chat as well, there is a website called Revision Village that posts a lot of past papers for the IB. It tends to be skew a little bit more like math sciencey, so they don't necessarily have all the US or like, history or humanities options. But I'm pretty sure that if, you guys are all very tech savvy students. I think if you were to put into Google IB past paper and then the course that you're in, you'll be able to find them. But Revision Village is a good resource for that.
Awesome. And then I saw that we just got one more final question in here that we can answer probably pretty quickly, asking about language classes, and that as someone who's struggling with it and they don't have to take the next level of their class, but should they or should they not do it? One thing to note from the college admissions standpoint, as particularly at highly selective colleges, is they do like to see those 5 core classes every year of high school. And those 5 core classes are your math, your science, your social science or history, your foreign language, and your English. So you do want to have that foreign language class as often as possible during your high school career. A lot of high schools do not require 4 years worth of foreign language, but colleges really like to see that, even if you are planning to major in something in a math or science field that doesn't really have to do with language. So if at all possible, stick with your language and see if you can get some tutoring or some additional support in that area. It's also possible that your struggle with language might have to do with a learning difference. And so if that is the case, you can always take a look to see if you have a learning difference that makes learning other languages hard for you, in which case you might be able to get sort of an exception for language classes. But that's really depends on whether it's just a class that you're having trouble with versus an actual learning difference that is making it extra challenging for you to learn that language.